so let's jump in. I think that at the start of us, like we deal with and work with a lot of regulated industries. And what's interesting is, confidential computing with trust assumptions turning into trust evidence is kind of the core of what we're going to talk about here. And we're going to look at two main kind of pieces of the problem domain, proving that the box and the actor are who they say they are for what our customers are trying to do. So we're going to go and dive into that a little bit. I'm sure you guys are all aware of a claim like this. In many situations, customers have competing interests with their customers, right? And in use cases we're going to talk about for healthcare, you have research hospitals, you have patients, they all have competing interests. And there's really not a technical way to solve some of these problems these customers have. And so right now, you have paperwork, you have contracts, and you have faith that people aren't going to do the bad things that you hope they don't do. But that has business implications too. So our customers literally spend 3-6 months sometimes negotiating contracts to try and protect intellectual property that they have no technical control over with existing systems anyways. So it's a big spot, it's a big problem. Let's jump into that a hair deeper. You'll like my little edit on this slide because there's kind of all these stakeholders in this environment and zero for verification between them, right? So if we take this healthcare kind of use case that we're going to drill into, you have this notion of an AI vendor and a device maker. In this case, it's a device maker. They're MRI machines, right? There's a concrete use case. I didn't know MRI machines ran AI models. Do you guys ever hear of that? Like, that was new to me. I'm like, what in the world are you doing? Are you serious? But there are people are doing this. There's dialysis machines running models. There's all sorts of things that are out there that are doing AI that you wouldn't expect. And they're doing it today, right? That's the interesting part. So from that perspective, the vendor and the device maker kind of become one, right? They're training models with IP, they're training on CT data, on scan data, on all these kinds of things. And then their customer is the hospital, and the hospital is concerned with compliance for protecting that data, customer data, and operating and executing that machine, right, and doing things. The patient, they're probably concerned about, I didn't consent for my data to go train somebody's model. I didn't consent for it to leave and go do anything. How am I protected? And then ultimately, anything that's running in these research hospitals, any of these devices, they're regulated. FDA is making sure that the thing that is running is the thing that should be running. And how those things change often impact significantly how they can redeploy things into that environment, right? So this creates some interesting points of conflict. And this is why today faith is kind of the only option between these parties, contracts and faith. And so we move forward here. What's interesting is if you start to map this into confidential computing from our customer space on your left, you kind of have the stakeholders, right? And you have an interesting thing that goes where the vendor who creates that model, and really what they're doing is they're getting a model from somewhere else. They're not creating a model on their own, but they're extending one, right? They're training it with additional information. And in a lot of cases, believe it or not, they're getting models just straight off Hugging Faces and using them and deploying them, which is a whole nother set of challenges, right? But they're going and they want to protect model weights. They want to protect that IP. They want to make sure that the hospitals won't extract from that model. And so you start getting these verified attestations, right? How do we encrypt and decrypt? How do we deal with these things? How do we tie them to a TE so that we can ensure that they execute properly? From a device maker perspective, again, the person making that MRI, what's the firmware integrity? How do I protect that? And how do I know that the device wasn't tampered with, it hasn't changed? And this is actually another interesting point from the customer perspective because people's lives are literally on the line here, right? They don't want to have some model that is running that has been altered. They have some very well-intentioned third parties and VARs that do things. They don't want them to be able to change it sometimes. In other situations, they actually have license agreements where people can change and retrain and do things in those hospitals. But that's the point, is it's kind of all over the place, and they need to enforce this. The hospital, of course, like we talked about, they're looking at patient data and how can they process that securely. The patient, they're worried about consent and is this being repurposed for training? And then the regulator themselves, how can they ensure that only clear models will run, right? And that's a big deal. How do you know that a model that's running today and tomorrow are the same model? There's some interesting questions in there. And so looking at how you can tie all that data together, leveraging confidential compute to provide the solutions to some of these problems is pretty fascinating. Next slide. So you have these mutually distrusting parties, and they can verify the claim that they care about without disclosing what they're protecting, and that's core of confidential compute. You've heard that from everybody as you've been here the last few days. And in this case, what we're looking at is, why does confidential compute solve this problem? Well, you have the encryption portion, so not just the data at rest or transit, right? We're TLS, SSL guys, we understand that, and crypto guys, but actually what's running in that machine, that boundary, right? We've had a lot of customers for decades who have reached out to us as PKI vendors saying, can we run your thing in our premise? Well, why? Because we need data sovereignty. We need to protect that. We need to make sure the keys are ours. We need to make sure data is ours. Confidential compute has given us an entirely different answer for answering that question rather than trying to deploy software for these people, right? And that means these things can be hardware rooted, right? So you can have that trust all the way down to the hardware root, which, by the way, these device manufacturers get. They've been deploying hardware roots of trust for a different kind of use. They call them the IoT birth certificates, and they're PKI-based, and we've been doing that with them for decades, right? So it's this interesting piece that comes together. And then how can this be remotely verifiable, right? So how can these parties know that these things were running trusted in this environment? This is a perfect fit for what these customers are trying to do. Now, the thing that gets pretty crazy, if you're familiar with rats, which many of you are, this five-party mess is an attestation topology. If you look at the device maker, that DigiCert ourselves, the regulator and key broker, they start to fall into these categories of pieces that map really well to the RATS framework, right? This is just what happened. We didn't try to map these things there. We just looked at the problem with the customers and we were like, wow, this actually works quite well with what is already established out there. And when we bring solutions to the customers that are standards-based, they're much more happy to use those things. So this becomes a clean way that customers can do this. So if we look at that problem then, there's two pieces, right? There's a lot of vendors out there that'll tell you about these wonderful solutions for protecting AI, this, that, and the other. And a lot of it is really good for greenfield, right? We're deploying something new, and isn't that wonderful? We can protect it. But how do you take a device that's sitting out there and actually protect that, right? We're doing both. We're talking about both, right? So we're working with people on new devices, but we're also working on these MRI machines that aren't going to be restacked tomorrow. How do you protect that thing? And there's a lot of complexity. I can't go into all of the complexity, but I'll go into some of the cool things that have happened on that journey to do that. So basically, we want to prove that box. This is our first domain here. So when you look at greenfield, like we just talked about, those are pretty easy. We understand that. We've all talked about that at this conference. From the brownfield perspective, right, these are things that could have been deployed a long time ago. FDA has declared a specific configuration that is acceptable and allowed. Sometimes these things can't even be taken offline, right? They're running as part of a critical infrastructure. Sometimes they have a TPM, sometimes they don't. They generally do not have something like TDX or anything available like that. So it's a very complex situation. And it means we can have a graduated kind of security risk that we can deploy depending on what the device is, right? I'm not here telling you we can secure every single brownfield device in the same way. Some of them we've been able to secure with people very well. Others, you guys are going to have a problem. So, but what's interesting is we're bringing those things down there, right? So if you look at how we're doing that and we look at brownfield, we're looking at how can we get a baseline on that measured boot. And you're all familiar, I'm sure, with how you get those golden states and what's happening in confidential. But remember I said that we've been issuing the device identity birth certificate to these things for years? Well, if you don't have a TPM there, we've been able to leverage device identity certificates to create that crypto packet that we can then use to provide decryption and operation across that system as it's running. So it's lesser protection than confidential, but it's still based off crypto, and it allows some modicum of protection for your IP and for the thing that's running there. However, once you introduce a TPM into that device, which, by the way, many medical devices within the last 10 years actually have them, we can start extending that to now bring in a full kind of confidential plane on those devices. One interesting thing about that is performance. A lot of medical devices have their CPU cycles basically consumed by everything that is happening on that device. You can't actually introduce more consumption. Those become a dead end. Many other devices actually are more modern, have a modern OSs, and you can get some compute cycles, and you can do some things. So it's another balancing act that we've had to figure out and work with. The models that are running on these things, obviously signing those things, getting those weights encrypted, and having key escrow and release so that you can have that key, you can have that model tied to a specific device, and you can have an escrow and release policy, all based off of that confidential compute control plane attestation becomes really valuable, because now you can have a remote attestation to say if that thing is bound or not. So this is really interesting. This means that we can support a number of paths, and you can see here a non-TPM path, which I just explained, right? Like leverage that existing birth certificate, do mutual crypto, and then get attestations from it, right? So we have these planes where there's varying degrees of security we could work with the customer. Again, it depends on what that device is capable of doing. So let's proceed further. So the evidence is what comes in, and the signed assurance is what comes out of this environment. The evidence collection is really looking at the workload, the TPM quote, the TD quote, using the tools to get that information, submitting that to DigiCert as a third-party verifier, and that comes into our infrastructure to be able to sign those things, and then verifying that against the RIMs for that environment, for whatever that could be. And that is actually a whole nother conversation, because these environments have all kinds of vendors, all kinds of interesting things that come in there, and we have to do some interesting things to create those sometimes. And then ultimately, we sign that attestation. So that signed token, cryptographically bound, so you can say that that attestation, that claim, what has happened there is cryptographically provable, and this is what is running, and this is what is approved on that box. So this is very, very interesting, because we can then do this for obviously cloud-based things that are being deployed. We can do this for fleets, right? So agents and VMs and things that people are deploying. And we can do this down to these physical devices. And by the way, these physical devices sometimes do and sometimes don't have network connectivity as well. That compounds the problem as well. Sometimes they do store and forward for network, and we have to deal with those things too. So this then brings us to kind of the next piece, is enforcement, right? So without breaking how that clinic works, you know, when we start talking to like a CISO and we talk about our platform, they're very interested in the fact that you can have a kill switch. You can say that if these attestations drift and this environment becomes somehow not trustworthy, stop at model execution and let us go do something. You can't do that in a clinic, right? You can't have an MRI just stop working. That's gonna be a bad day. So technically, we can have these same controls, right? Technically, we can have these same detection. But what we need to do is make sure that there's a clinically safe degradation mode, right? And what does that mean? That means it's different for every kind of device we work with. It's different for every kind of manufacturer. But it means what's a safe fallback that gives them the protections they need over this environment, but allows the clinic to continue running and doing the things that they need to do. And that's often more of a business decision than a technical one, right? So what happens there is we're able to do this and create a situation where that MRI machine doesn't become a safety hazard, right? That's what we want to avoid. So if we look at a real deployment, and this is kind of capturing, I'll show you the interface of our product next. We do a lot of things behind the scenes to make this work. We're able, obviously, to do this on brownfield devices in the field. We're able to do this on VMs in the cloud. We're able to do this into a number of different environments where people are running because of the nature of what's happening. And as we're doing that, what we're doing is also leveraging things like ledgers, right? So these attestations and these claims are going out to ledgers where we're cryptographically signing those things, so you have a further evidence chain of proof with what has happened in the environment. So we're kind of pulling together these cores that we've done for a long time as DigiCert to provide that log. You can see on the left, as you're provisioning something, all of this great activity happens. From a user interface perspective, if you're doing this through our interface, you would see something like this. If you're doing it through the command line, you'd see it come out elsewhere. But we're doing all these activities to synchronize and make confidential compute easy, right? I think one of the slides I wanted to work in here and I wasn't able to was the SpongeBob slide where it's like 10 hours later, if you've seen those. Anybody who's tried to deploy a confidential VM probably have felt that slide, right? It takes forever to deploy. So there's things that you need to do to optimize and make those kinds of things work, and especially when you start going into brownfield devices that maybe have lower kind of CPU constraints, there's a whole different kind of boot process there. And if that boot process needs to exist within FDA structure, that's a different kind of question you have to answer too, right? So let's go to the next piece here. Just tracking quick on my time. Problem number 2. We've proven the box. Now how do we prove the actor? So this attestation needs to work across that software, right? There's a very complex environment that's going here. So now we're looking at agents running in these environments. They're workloads, they're not users. What's interesting is traditional IAM vendors, they will tell you that IAM is a solution for this. I was at Identiverse just last week, and they're all telling you how they could solve agent identity problems. Agents aren't people, right? They're fundamentally workloads. And so that means IAM solutions have been optimized for human workflows. I have phones, I have authentication, I have two-factor. But really, if you start going to how standards have moved, Gartner, IETF with WSME, NIST, and CCOE, they've all come together and they're viewing this as workloads. We've actually submitted a white paper to NIST that I authored around this concept of how agents are workloads and how you can govern them with identity protections as workloads. And if you start viewing them that way, well, now you can do some interesting things with these agents, and you can couple that with confidential computing. And we'll talk about that more. So I'll have a QR code at the end. You can download some of these white papers and things if you want to see them. But fundamentally, we are taking that identity and we're putting it into an AI agent passport, which is an open source claim that we've created. We're working with a number of industry partners on this. And that NIST paper actually describes that passport. We have another white paper that describes it as well. We're working with many parties on this. But what it does is it fundamentally brings together identity, policy, lineage, and ownership of that agent, of that model, of that MCP server into effectively a JSON structure that's pretty extensible. And it's expandable, right? So you can add anything. And guess what? The first things customers wanted to add to this was, can you get the attestations from my confidential environment attested into that passport so I can have those claims bound together? And then can I use those passports to federate the identity of those agents between two organizations, right? Company A, Company B, common trust anchor. How do I know that those agents should be able to talk? And how do I know what their capabilities are that they can do these things? They're embedded in this passport. Passports can be revoked too. Passports are also very short-lived documents. So they're not a very long-lived thing. They're very short-lived. We like short-lived these days, make them cryptographically secure. And that pulls this notion together so that you have the passport carrying that attestation and lineage together, where you have the box proven with the TEE and Recor being the ledger for the backing portion of that. The passport is getting that receipt of all of the other attributes we just discussed in there, and then that gets to travel with the agent. It's a very light way to travel with the agent to prove that identity. And so that means that this identity then is also rooted in silicon fundamentally. And that is a very powerful identity for people to be able to solve that part of the problem, right? The first part of the problem is that the box with the right things running? The second is that the right actor on that box? So this provides one continuous chain of evidence, and every link is evidence not based off faith, right? If you remember our problem at the very beginning, everything was based off faith. What's interesting is we start at the silicon layer. From measured boot, we move into the firmware. The model becomes signed and attested, and we protect that, and we encrypt that, weights as well as a simplified version. And then the SVID for the workload that is operating becomes embedded into this environment. And all of that becomes a gating factor for the agent actions. What does that agent want to do? What can it interoperate with? And does it have permission to do so? Another note that's not captured on this slide is because this is extensible, there's simple policy in here, like agent can or can't access certain domain. But there's also a complex policy where, as an example, we're working with a customer and we're linking back to policies that are defined as network policies in GCP with its robust rule sets, and we can enforce them through the passport as well, right? So it's a very open structure that allows people to do these kinds of enforcement and identity protections. So continually doing this, continually generating these assertions and having these represented as passports. So this is where we all come in. There's some gaps in here, right? Standards work can close a lot of these pieces, but what are the reference values for AI artifacts? We have been working with some of our tools where we have software bill of materials, crypto bill of materials, AI bill of materials are popping up now. But what does that really mean, right? Like what are we representing in there? And as an industry and as a group, I think those are things we can pull together and make some common sense of that because it's a little open right now. RAS profiles that span layers, right? So this is a tough one, right? So when you are trying to span between that device, that workload boundary, and figure out how things work together, where's the definition of those roles? And I think that's another piece that we want to work on. Whimsy for agents, right? So workload identity that lands on agents. Right now, our solution is built on SPIFFE and Spire as standards, and we're implementing those things, and we're expanding those further for SVIDs and identification. And then if you're familiar with software trust, SCIT for the audit chain, right? So how do we have those transparent append-only records across that whole life cycle of this event? So we're contributing. We're working as DigiCert in all of these areas. And like I mentioned, we have papers and positions filed into a lot of these areas, and we're pulling them together. And again, we're doing this because of the crypto work and the things that we've been building and how we view the problem space. And so, I'd love to work with anybody else here who's interested in these things. Reach out to me afterwards. I want to talk to you about them. But we're building this today, right? And so here's a QR code you can hit to get some of these documents that I was talking about earlier. But again, if you guys are working on these things and you want to share some things, I would love to connect with you. Yesterday, we actually launched our preview version of this to our customers. We have customers in this environment right now, so it's a big day. I didn't know it was going to happen yesterday. I would have had a slide about it, but we got it up yesterday. We got some people in there, which is awesome. But we're learning things, right? We're getting this into preview with customers. We're learning some things about how they're getting through this, and those are beyond our design customers that helped us get this far. So last but not least on the slide here is what does this all look like together? It's a bit of an eye chart, sorry about that. And I usually build this slide, but I didn't know how much time I would have. But basically what we have been able to do is from the problem I talked about was in healthcare, but it also impacts finance, defense, and legal, right? There's all these kind of regulated industries. And we're protecting those models, we're registering and signing them in step 2. We're expanding those to run into a confidential complaint that goes in cloud or on device, as I talked about, greenfield and brownfield. And then providing controlled access, like through our combination of passports and access controls for insurance fine-tuning and other things people are doing in these environments. And then that last piece I talked about is that monitoring and response, right? So monitoring continuous attestations, monitoring the environment as well, and then providing automated responses for things like blocking access and stopping things that are going on. And then fundamentally, all of this is in a tamper-evident audit trail that utilizes those ledgers and things to secure that, but it gives you that compliance hook that if you need to prove something for any point of time for these environments that we're running, you can absolutely do that. And that's fundamentally what we've been working on for this space, and I wanted to tell you guys about today with our journey with what we've done with confidential compute. So thank you.